Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining us. It is the Wednesday edition here of Point of View, and just a great opportunity for you as we are going to be talking about a number of issues in the news. We'll get into the whole idea of voting by mail, I guess I should say, and the whole question of school closures, both of which right now are generally accepted by the American people, which is one of the reasons I come back to these topics, because I think if you knew more about some of these issues, you might change your mind. And if not, at least we want to put some facts on the table that don't get discussed oftentimes in the mainstream media. A little bit later next hour, we'll be talking about this new book coming out in September, which is entitled, again, Sanctified Sexuality. And it's a book that is really going to help you understand a variety of issues that we talk about so often here on Point of View. I mean, this ranges from sexual identity and gender dysphoria. It ranges from things like cohabitation and divorce, infertility. I mean, there are just a variety of topics that are part of this very extensive book. And just the other day, we had one of the editors in that studio to talk about that. We have another one of the editors and one of the contributors in at 1 o'clock. So I think you'll appreciate that as well. Lots to cover, but let me come back to a topic I just mentioned in passing yesterday, and that is that horrific explosion that took place in Beirut, Lebanon. Frank Gaffney's been on the program with us many times before. And he basically said Beirut used to be known as the Paris of the Middle East, a beautiful and civilized oasis in a region that for centuries has been racked by death and destruction, much of it at the hands of jihadists. Today, he said, that city lies largely in smoldering ruins as a result of a devastating set of explosions that destroyed what was left of the Christian quarter and vital port facilities. While what triggered this catastrophe is unclear, we do know that Hezbollah warehoused nearly 3,000 tons of ammonium nitrate in the midst of its long-standing enemies in the Christian community. The jihadists knew full well the danger. They had used this highly explosive substance in successive murderous terrorist attacks. So his point is, as the world mobilizes to provide humanitarian relief to Lebanon, it must go to the victims, not go to empower or legitimately or even legitimize the jihadists responsible for their suffering. So while we don't know if this was intentional or accidental, the placing of this very combustive ammonium nitrate in the Christian community, in the Christian quarter, I think guaranteed that sooner or later this tragedy would actually take place. Jim Garrity talks about this as well, and just talks about how in an instant a city is devastated and left forever changed because, again, there are people that have wondered about whether this was set off by some kind of explosion or whatever. But nevertheless, he says the videos out of Beirut, Lebanon yesterday induced gasp. You could be forgiven for initially wondering if that massive shockwave indeed came from something nuclear or attempt to trigger a nuclear explosion. The blast appears to stem from, as he points out, 2,700 tons of ammonium nitrate, a chemical commodity used in fertilizer and bombs, which had been stored in a warehouse in the port since it was confiscated from a cargo ship in 2014. Now, that was 6 years ago. Okay, just to help you understand that. To get some perspective on this, the Oklahoma City bomb used about 2 tons of ammonium nitrate. This one was 2,700 tons of ammonium nitrate. The blast registered 3.5 on the Richter scale, used to measure, of course, earthquakes. As of this morning, more than 100 dead, more than 4,000 injured, and an estimated 300,000 left homeless as the blast tore apart buildings like they were children's blocks. The scene afterwards was downright apocalyptic, he says. For once, a catastrophic loss of Lebanese life can't be traced back to Hezbollah, at least not directly. That's where I wanted you to hear from Frank Gaffney. Yes and no. The location of that in the Christian sector, I think, is something to pay attention to as well. But nevertheless, back to Jim Garrity. As of this writing, it appears this calamity stems from Lebanese government port managers who could figure out that the vessel that was initially shipping the ammonium nitrate was unsafe, but were not wise enough to realize that storing all of that in a warehouse under extreme heat for years presented a separate danger. And so you've got some reports that have come from various groups talking about this. The crew essentially were hostages, were running out of provisions, and so they warned about the dangers of the cargo, and that was back in 2013. So you can recognize that this warning was there for some time. By October of 2015, the ammonium nitrate was transferred to warehouses. And one of the statements being made there was, quote, owing to the risk associated with retaining ammonium nitrate on board the vessel, the port authorities discharged the cargo onto the port's warehouses. The vessel and cargo remain to date in port awaiting auctioning or proper disposal. And it sat there for, by that time, 5 years. But, of course, it was originally confiscated 6 years ago. And as we mentioned just a minute ago, Jim Garrity reminds us that after World War II, Beirut earned the nickname the Paris of the Middle East, a status that ended with the civil war in the 1970s and resulted in the terrorism of the 1980s. The Lebanese lived as sort of a vassal state to Syria for many years. Way back in 2004, he points out the fact that he had a chance to actually do some things to irk those in that particular region of the world. But I'll go on to say, again, Beirut began to enjoy some cultural and economic resurgence in the 2000s. Then it lost a great deal of ground in the Israel-Hezbollah war. Things began to look up again in June as some of the protests across Lebanon were, again, a notoriously sectarian country united across social and religious lines to condemn the power of the Islamic Republic's most successful export, which, of course, is Hezbollah. And late last month, even the country's economic situation was devastated by hyperinflation driven by government mismanagement and corruption and electricity shortages. So, again, a region of the country that has been troubled for many centuries, for a while, a very beautiful city where people used to come and to enjoy the Mediterranean, but Hezbollah has turned it into a devastated area of the world, and one that certainly was even more devastated by the explosion of ammonium nitrate. Whether done intentionally or not, the reality is just the same. We have lots of victims on the ground, and I just wanted to let you know a little bit more about what we've learned about what took place in Beirut, Lebanon yesterday. Let's, when we come back, talk about what is happening with the pandemic. What I find so interesting is we're already starting to see some of these states almost acting like separate countries, and in one particular case, setting up checkpoints and mandating quarantines. And if you violate the quarantine, the fine could be as much as $10,000. So there are some people getting very serious about the pandemic. And that's, of course, being used to justify not opening the schools, which we'll talk about right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
It appears that mathematics and grammar are now also examples of racism and Western imperialism. At least that is what we're hearing on a number of college campuses. Nancy Piercy writes about one teacher who argues that the idea of 2 plus 2 equaling 4 is cultural and a product of Western imperialism and colonialism. Apparently, even mathematics is to be reshaped by critical theory. Lest you think this is the only example, she provides many others. A professor at Cambridge University wrote an article titled "Western Mathematics, the Secret Weapon of Cultural Imperialism." A professor at University of Illinois complains that math history is Eurocentric because we emphasize terms like Pythagorean theorem and pi, which perpetuate a perception that mathematics was largely developed by Greeks and other Europeans. Nancy Piercy questions that. We use Arabic numbers. We have learned that the concept of zero as a placeholder came from India, and the Babylonians gave us a 360-degree circle. In fact, most cultures had a rough idea of the value of pi. Meanwhile, grammar is also under attack. The English department at Rutgers University is changing its instruction in an effort to stand with and respond to the Black Lives Matter movement. The program will emphasize social justice and critical grammar. That's a euphemism for challenging the standard academic form of the English language. One of the professors argues that expecting a student to write in grammatically correct sentences is indicative of racial bias, which she condemns using a word I cannot use on this radio station. Lately, when I've been reading social media posts, I've been appalled at the poor grammar of recent college graduates. Apparently, it's going to get much worse. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Socialism, go to viewpoints.info/socialism. That's viewpoints.info/socialism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
All sorts of things have been happening during this coronavirus pandemic that you might not have predicted a number of years ago. And if you are thinking about going to New York City, be forewarned. Now, of course, if you show up at the airport, they're already going to check you. But now, New York City is even setting up checkpoints for any out-of-state travelers that want to make their way into the city. The mayor, Bill de Blasio, announced that just the other day, and so they're setting up quarantine checkpoints at major bridges and tunnels into the city. The direct quote from the mayor was, "New York City is holding the line against COVID-19, and New Yorkers have shown tremendous discipline. We're not going to let our hard work slip away, and we'll continue to do everything we can to keep New Yorkers safe and healthy." Their estimates are, I don't know where they come up with these, but again, we'll just trust the numbers, that about a fifth of all the new coronavirus cases in the city are from out-of-state visitors. And so local authorities are planning to set up a checkpoint at Penn Station to check visitors who arrive by train. If you are driving in, either in the tunnel or the bridges, then again, we're going to be checking you. And if in one way or another you violate quarantine, and again, it's a little bit questionable how they will check all of that, you can be fined up to $10,000. So pretty heavy reaction at a time when, let's be honest, as we've pointed out over the last couple of days, the number of deaths and the number of infections seems to be going down. And if you would like to look at those charts, we posted some of those yesterday in an article that you can find and then print them out and see them for yourself. Of course, each day we have new charts, but the one from yesterday is probably giving you a pretty good idea. Okay, in the midst of all this, there have been real questions about opening the schools. I recognize that if you ask the typical American today, should we reopen the schools, a very significant majority say no, it's just too dangerous. Now, that comes, if you will, and almost flies in the face of what the American Academy of Pediatrics is saying, what has been written in the New England Journal of Medicine. It's contrary to what is happening in many of these European countries, in Australia and elsewhere. But again, I recognize this is a place where we try to give you some of the facts. And if you disagree and say, no, I don't want my children or grandchildren going to school, got that. You know, that's a place where we can agree to disagree. And that will be fine, because if nothing else, you want to be safe. And I understand that completely. What I think we could all agree on is there is growing evidence that the teachers' unions are using this in a way to actually become quite political. And that leads me to my first article, which interestingly enough is written by the editors of the Wall Street Journal. Now, they usually don't write about education that much because, after all, they're worried about, you know, your investments and the economy, and they pay attention to it a little bit because obviously that affects taxpayers, and so then that gets their attention. But the editors of the Wall Street Journal put it this way: teachers' unions seem to think it's an opportunity to squeeze more money from taxpayers and put their private and public charter school competition out of business. And so over the last couple of days, there have been people that have grown real concerned about how the teachers' unions are reacting to some of this. If you listened to our conversation yesterday, I talked about the fact that there were protests in places like the District of Columbia. But now we have even more. The leader of the American Federation of Teachers, that's Randy Weingarten, declared support for what are called safety strikes, where if a local union feels that a school district may not have taken enough steps to mitigate COVID-19, and the criteria there is very subjective, by the way, I might mention, then he says that they are going to actually have a safety strike and simply not show up for work. Then on Monday, an alliance of teachers' unions and various progressive groups sponsored what they called a National Day of Resistance around the country, because they were then listing the demands that must be met before returning to the classroom. And so one of those demands was support for our communities and families by canceling rents and mortgages. The other night I was talking to somebody who owns a number of these buildings where various businesses are, and he still expects people to pay their rent. And one particular facility decided to gather together and say, we're only going to pay half the rent. He may encourage them to find another place. But nevertheless, a moratorium on evictions, foreclosures, providing direct cash assistance to the unemployed, and the list goes on and on. A massive infusion of federal money to support the reopening of various organizations by taxing billionaires and Wall Street. Then also a moratorium on new charter programs, new voucher programs, and a moratorium on standardized testing. Those are all the things that are supposed to be met. Those are demands that to be met before public school teachers will go back to the classroom. Isn't that amazing? And so the question that was asked by the editors of the Wall Street Journal is there a definition for that action? And they said the phrase for this is political extortion. Rather than work to open schools safely, the unions are issuing ultimatums and threatening strikes until they're granted their ideological wish list, and children who would have to endure more lost instruction are their hostages. They go on to say these public unions are also lobbying their political allies to keep public, charter, and private schools closed, because they don't want those charter schools to be open, because then they will even demonstrate more how effective they are compared to the public schools. And then, interestingly enough, the order came in spite, interestingly enough, of the fact that the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention saying that reopening schools with in-person instruction is a step towards improving public health, especially for low-income and minority children. And of course, I've talked about this before because there are all sorts of health benefits by kids being in school. If nothing else, we can recognize any problems at home, which could be abuse, any problems in terms of access to food, even maybe diagnosis of certain kinds of issues, medical issues by the school nurse. There are all sorts of benefits by being at a school, not being at home. But, of course, there's another issue because when you close down the public schools, almost without exception, the governors, not all, and so I'm painting with a broad brush, but I recognize there's a few exceptions. But most of them say if the public schools are closed, the private and religious schools have to be closed as well. And that's another place where the editors of the Wall Street Journal point this out. Because public schools are funded whether they're open or not. But private and religious schools, which rely on tuition and donations, don't have that luxury. As a matter of fact, the Cato Institute Center for Educational Freedom recognizes and already estimates probably more than 100 private and religious schools have been shut down permanently due to COVID-19. And just take one more example, since I just mentioned New York. New York's Catholic Diocese has already announced the closure of 20 of their parochial schools. So you can kind of see where that takes us. Gary Bauer the other day was talking about this, and he said, if parents didn't have enough to worry about, the big teachers' unions are exploiting the coronavirus to make outrageous demands that have virtually nothing to do with education. Once again, the teachers' unions, Gary Bauer says, and their progressive allies are calling for a national day of resistance. We just talked about that, against the idea of reopening the schools. And again, some of the demands, canceling rents and mortgages, bans on new charter schools, a new wealth tax on billionaires. And as they say, this editorial in the Wall Street Journal says, this is political extortion with the left-wing unions issuing ultimatums and holding our children's education hostage to their demands. And so I love how Gary Bauer ends that little piece. He says, first they close our houses of worship. Then they take away our right of assembly. Now they're holding our children hostage. He says it's getting hard to distinguish the progressive left from a hostile foreign invader. So, if nothing else, just another piece of the puzzle and a real concern. We may have an agreement or disagreement about whether or not to reopen the schools, but when the teachers' unions are now holding the schools hostage and are using what are actually probably best described as political extortion, I think that should concern all of us, and it's just a good illustration of how far we've come in this country. When we come back from the break, a couple of other issues. I know another topic, which is oftentimes controversial, is whether we should have vote by mail. Again, an overwhelming percentage of Americans think that that would be safe and is actually something we should do. But I thought, if nothing else, I wanted to read from Ari Fleischer, who said, as a survivor of the 2000 presidential recount, I don't want anyone to go through what happened to George Bush or Al Gore, and makes the very compelling case that this time we might not have a delayed election. We might have an election that everybody would question because of some of these ballots. So we'll explain that. But we need to take a break. We have a lot more to cover. We'll do so right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Let me start with a question. Are you aware of the fact that even while the pandemic and the number of cases of COVID-19 are dropping, there is another statistic that has actually shot through the roof? You might say, well, what would that be? The number of homicides, according to Gary Bauer, and this comes from the Wall Street Journal, is soaring. So far this year, murders are up 24%, with more than 3,600 people that have been killed. If you look at the analysis that was in the Wall Street Journal, 3/4 of the nation's 50 largest cities have seen double-digit increases in their murder rates. Now, the question I have for you, at a time when almost every day you turn on either your local news or you watch the national news or you go out on the internet and you go to different websites or you check your social media feed, how many times have you heard people talking about the pandemic, the coronavirus, and those kinds of things? And even now that they are declining, you had to look really hard the other day. For example, I found one article we posted in Breitbart. The only other national news service that actually spent any time talking about the decline in the number of cases was UPI. Now, again, UPI is a shadow of its former self. There used to be the Associated Press and UPI. Matter of fact, I used to do commentaries for UPI, and I think in part because they started recognizing to get some market share, maybe they'd let a Christian in every once in a while to do a commentary, radio commentary. Anyway, that's a long story from a long time ago, but UPI is almost insignificant, and that was where you had to go to find one of the other articles. That's where Rush Limbaugh had the link. I found another one, and so while we're not hearing a great deal about the decline in the coronavirus cases, we're even hearing less about something that is soaring, and that is the number of homicides, the murder rate. And of course, as you might imagine, as we've talked on this program before, the murder capital of the country is Chicago, with at least 440 homicides this year so far. And you have the police superintendent, David Brown, who said July was the deadliest month in Chicago's history. This is Chicago. Do you remember the 1930s? Do you remember Prohibition? Do you remember gangsters? Do you remember Al Capone? This was the deadliest month in the history of Chicago. Think that through for just a minute. And you're hearing about it today, probably on Point of View and nowhere else. I won't spend a lot more time on that because one of the other things Gary Bauer points out is not only are the homicides up, but we, in many of these progressive cities, are letting criminals out of jail to relieve the crowding and the whole concerns about the pandemic. And so as a result, you're seeing more individuals who have already committed a crime, who've been let out recently or early, who I think also possibly are part of the reason for that increase. Not the least of which, of course, is defund the police. How many police officers now are going to go out there and preemptively control the neighborhoods? They're going to try to keep their head down, stay out of any confrontation as possible, especially when we watch, as you've now probably had a chance to see, the video of Michael Brown before you have that police officer put his knee on his neck. You realize he was perhaps in all sorts of respiratory distress because he was taking fentanyl. But anyway, you watch some of these and just say, you know, why would a police officer get involved in some of these unless he's absolutely forced to do so because he doesn't feel like he's going to be supported by his community? So that's another issue. And one last one. As you might imagine, the number of people asking for background checks so they can buy a firearm has up 44% over last year. Because more and more people, I think, are starting to come to the conclusion that I cannot call the police might not be there, and given the amount of chaos taking place right now, as you've heard us say so many times, when minutes count, or when seconds count, police are only minutes away. And so that is just a quick summary of some of that. You might want to go back to my booklet on the biblical point of view on criminal justice to see how to handle some of those issues. But I thought I would get into another controversial issue. Controversial in the sense that I find myself trying to give evidence which in some respects is contrary to the way people are actually believing right now. A majority of people believe that we should not reopen the schools, but I've tried to give you evidence for why I think that makes sense. A very significant majority of people believe that voting by mail is fine and is not going to be creating any kind of problem, which is why I posted this second article for you to read by Ari Fleischer. By the way, if you don't remember Ari Fleischer, he was press secretary for George W. Bush, and he says, you know, if the 4 years since election 2016 haven't been tumultuous enough, he says, wait until this year's election day night. If the election is close, that one night will be fraught with more risk and danger than anything people have imagined over the almost 4 years of the Trump presidency to date. He says, as a survivor of the 2000 recount, I do not want anyone to go through what happened to George W. Bush and Al Gore. But the point he's making is, even with the 2000 recount, hanging chads, for those of you that were around at that time. And I recognize some of our younger audience were young kids or weren't around then and don't really remember that. That was a delayed election. But he is now making a very compelling case that in this case, the election might not be resolved because it could be either rigged, marked with fraud, and the outcome really could be in doubt. For example, couple facts before we take our next break. Turnout this year probably will break all records for turnout. Why? He says, well, inspired by either the love of President Trump or the hate for President Trump, turnout increases already were very significant in 2016. And so as a result, there's every reason to believe that there will be massive turnout again. Now, in Florida, if you believe these polls, and I don't, but let's look at the polls for just a minute, Trump is up by all of 5,000 votes over Joe Biden. In Ohio, Biden's up by about 5,000 votes over Trump. And in many of the other swing states, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Wisconsin, Iowa, Georgia, too close to call. So you can figure out real quickly that some of these states actually will be decided by either absentee ballots or vote by mail ballots, which are different, by the way. We'll get into that in just a minute. And so, again, according to 2016, the U.S. Election Assistance Commission, there were about 33 million absentee ballots that were cast 4 years ago, which was about, a significant percentage of those. And only about 1% of those actually rejected, but still that amounted to 318,000 votes that were thrown out because in many cases the signature on the ballot did not match the signature on the record. In Florida, 21,000 of those ballots were rejected. In Pennsylvania, remember how close that was, 17,000 ballots were rejected. In Ohio, 13,000 ballots were rejected. In Ohio, 10,000 ballots. Well, you can do the math, and I'll spare you. And that is, it is quite possible that the absentee ballots or the vote by mail ballots might determine who the president is, and we will not know that on election night. We may not know that for a few days. And again, if we've had as much problem with vote by mail ballots as we are having right now isn't that interesting, in Democratic primaries, we might not ever really resolve that issue. Let's use one example. I've told you before about what has happened in the third largest city in New Jersey, Paterson, where the city council race, we have no idea who won. But let's use a more relevant one, which is actually in this article by Ari Fleischer, and that is in the 12th congressional district in New York. We do not know to this day who won the Democratic primary, because what you have is the incumbent Congresswoman Carolyn Maloney was running against a very progressive opponent, and so it ended up too close to call. There were all sorts of ballots that were actually rejected. As a matter of fact, are you ready for this? 25% of these absentee ballots, or 12,000 votes, were rejected for a variety of reasons, which is why now the challenger is suing the court demanding every vote count. And the reason they were thrown out is because in some cases they didn't have postmarks, they didn't have signatures, they had all sorts of everything. And of course, a lot of these just showed up after the fact. And since they did not have a postmark on it, it was hard to see which ones maybe were actually valid ballots and which ones were just sitting in a mailbox and somebody picked up, filled them all out, and sent them all in, pretending to be the person. And so we, to this day, do not know who won the 12th Congressional District primary on the Democratic side. And it brings me to a conversation we had off air. Why are Democrats against this? Well, I think in part because they honestly say, Bill Clinton and certainly Barack Obama are for vote by mail, and Donald Trump is against it, so we have to be for it. But there's pretty good evidence coming out now that, if anything, Donald Trump might benefit, especially in rural districts, from vote by mail balloting. But facts be set aside because nobody really seems to care. We'll be right back.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And for a few more minutes, let me just mention that we do have some information on school closings and opening schools and what many people are calling the school opening extortion. I just mentioned a little bit on this issue of voting by mail. I need an extra minute to actually finish that off, but let me just say that, again, there are all sorts of questions as to who might benefit from the issue of voting by mail. But I do appreciate the fact that in some cases here, Ari Fleischer points out that if you have had a country or a state or even a city that's had some experience with that, that is going to be less of a problem. And he points out, for example, you can talk about the state of Washington, which has had a fair amount of experience with vote by mail, and as a result, were able to fix some of the potential problems. The problem is compounded, as he points out, by the fact that even though they had a long history of in-mail voting, it took years to get the process right. But now, just imagine trying to conduct that during a pandemic, and that, of course, is the real issue. Again, it has become politicized. There are some people even suggesting that voting by mail actually would help Donald Trump, even though he's against it, and voting by mail actually would hurt Joe Biden, even though he is for it. So you can see that sometimes facts aren't necessarily at the forefront of where people take a stand on a particular issue. But let me get to my third article, and then next hour we're going to be talking about this idea of sanctified sexuality, and we have Dr. Sandra Glahn and Dr. Glenn Kreider in studio. I'm looking forward to that interview. It's a book coming out in September, which I know you're going to really appreciate. But I posted one other piece, and it has to do with the so-called fact checkers and who they really are. Now, we've pointed out before that fact checking is a difficult business because sometimes when somebody asserts something, whether it is Joe Biden or Donald Trump, whether it's Nancy Pelosi, whether it is maybe even a commentator on television, radio, whatever, sometimes you can come to the conclusion that there really may be two ways to see that statistic. So we recognize that even when you have a fact checker, most of the time you have to pay attention to how egregious that fact checking might be. And if you get one of those 4 Pinocchios from the Washington Post, pretty good evidence that what you said was completely fallacious. That being said, it has been interesting that Cheryl Atkinson, who used to be one of those practitioners of media with the mainstream media and since has left, has pointed out something in a recent article, and that is to look at some of the people providing these fact checks and to see that there's a tremendous amount of bias. And so here's kind of how it's put together. She says, fact-checking organizations have grappled internally with the obvious but usually unspoken challenge in such efforts. It is unrealistic to expect that any appointed group of fact-checkers have true expertise on all the topics they litigate, yet they do so every single day. We talked about that earlier this week about hydroxychloroquine, and we've talked about that with COVID-19, and certainly we can talk about that with science issues, and we can talk about that in terms of whether the Congressional Budget Office is providing a dynamic model of the impact of taxes or a static model. There's all sorts of issues like that. And so nothing else. It goes on to say, keeping this in mind, the biggest inherent flaw with fact-checking may be the qualifications or the bias or conflicts of interest of those fact-checkers. And here's the example we want to put forward. One example, she says, is the fact-checking nonprofit First Draft. It is started by Google, and it was really begun at the beginning of kind of the 2016 election cycle. Google, by the way, is owned by Alphabet Inc., and Alphabet executives and employees comprise really perhaps one of the most politically active groups that rank along some of the largest political donors to Democrats. And so in some respects, that is something to pay attention to. But then goes on to even more in more detail talk about the fact that First Draft, which again is the fact checker that was started by Google, is supported by an array of liberal companies and nonprofits, including the George Soros Open Society Foundations. And First Draft actually tends to fact check topics in a vein that is consistent with many of those people that actually donate to that organization. So that's one way to look at it. Here's another one, which you mentioned the other day in our roundtable discussion. If you look at Facebook's oversight board members, these are the people that look over some of the decisions made. Are we going to pull this particular article from Facebook or not? 18 of the 20 members of the Facebook Oversight Board have ties to, again, George Soros Open Society Foundations, which have spent billions of dollars on all sorts of global initiatives, everything ranging from immigration policy, climate change, abortion, gender, racial policies, and the rest. So I wanted to post that, if for no other reason, just to help you understand that not all fact checkers and not all fact checking are created equal. Some of them seem to have more bias than others, and it's reasonable to evaluate that as well. Just before we take a break and we spend some time talking about sanctified sexuality, I thought I would mention my Viewpoints commentary today, which asked the question, are math and grammar racist? And you've got to be thinking, you're making this up. I wish I was. I found this originally through Nancy Pearcey and then some other things as well. Nancy Pearcey's been on the program with us many times before, but she talks about the fact that there are individuals that are now starting to say things like mathematics are inherently Western imperialism or colonialism. And she gives us some quotes there from one individual that says that really even the idea of 2 + 2 = 4 is cultural and a product of Western imperialism and colonialism. I go on to say, unless you think that's one example, provides a few others. Professor at Cambridge University wrote an article entitled Western Mathematics, the Secret Weapon of Cultural Imperialism. Professor at the University of Illinois complained that when we talk about math history, it's just predominantly Eurocentric because it emphasizes terms like the Pythagorean theorem, or pi, which she says perpetuate a perception that mathematics was largely developed by Greeks and other Europeans. I love Nancy Pearcey. She says, that's sort of questionable. We use Arabic numbers. We learned that the concept of zero as a placeholder came from India. Babylonians gave us the 360-degree circle. And in fact, most cultures had a rough idea of the value of pi. Meanwhile, then I also point out that you can go and find some raising some other questions. The English department at Rutgers University is changing its instruction in an effort to stand with and respond to Black Lives Matter movement. The program will emphasize social justice, critical grammar, and a number of other things, which actually is kind of a euphemism for challenging the standard academic form of the English language. Matter of fact, one of the professors argues that expecting a student to write in grammatically correct sentences is indicative of racial bias. I'm sure our guests that are going to be in here in studio in a minute are going to have some questions about that, and actually uses a word to describe that, which frankly I can't use on the radio because it's one of those words we're not supposed to use. But again, if you've read any of the latest kind of social media posts, you recognize that even some of our recent college graduates, their grammar's not very good. But when you have attacks on math and grammar, by the way, I mentioned University of Illinois. There's another professor at Illinois that is now calling for suspending teaching any history right now in the public schools because he contends that any teaching of history, especially from a Western perspective, is by definition racist. So that's the commentary for today. And if you find yourself saying, you have got to be making it up, I wish I was, because we have some footnotes for you to follow and to read it yourself. We come back, though, we're going to talk about this issue of sanctified sexuality. What about sexual identity? What about gender stereotypes? What about some of the issues that we discuss so often here on Point of View? Going to have two guests in studio. One that is the co-editor of the book, another contributor, and it's a book coming out in September with Kriegel, academic. We'll be back right after this.
2020. It's been a pretty eventful year. We've experienced international tensions over the coronavirus and lockdowns, economic uncertainties, cities overrun by protests, rioting, and looters, and coming soon, a presidential election. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It is easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. We are going to spend some time over the next couple of hours getting into a variety of different issues. This first hour, we're going to spend some time talking about a book that will be coming out shortly, and I think you'll want to pre-order it. Matter of fact, last week we had Dr. Gary Barnes in studio, and he was one of the co-editors of Sanctified Sexuality, Valuing Sex in an Oversexed World. We are going to be talking about sexuality today, but I don't think I need to issue a parental advisory in case kids are listening. I think we're going to be focusing on relatively safe topics, but I'll let you make that decision. And we are privileged to have in studio with us today the other co-editor, Dr. Sandra Glahn, who has been with us before, professor of media arts and worship at Dallas Theological Seminary, with a graduate from Washington Bible College, Dallas Theological Seminary, and the University of Texas at Dallas. So it is great to have you back in studio.
To be here. Thank you so much.
And also I want to bring to the microphone Dr. Glenn Kreider, who is the acting chair and professor of theological studies at Dallas Theological Seminary as well, a graduate of Lancaster Bible College, Dallas Theological Seminary. Great to have you here with us as well.
Thank you.
I might just mention that the next hour we'll get into some of the issues in the news. Do we reopen the schools, the pandemic, and a number of others? And then we'll be talking about technology in the last part of that hour with an individual that is with the Discovery Institute and also writes for Breakpoint on how to think about this idea of technology from a Christian point of view. But Dr. Glahn, let me come to you for just a minute, because the other day when we had Gary Barnes. Oh, well, sometimes we have Gary Bauer here as well.
Gary Bauer's great too.
Yeah, but Gary Barnes here in studio, we were talking about the fact that one of the reasons that you decided to pursue this topic and to write this book is because there's just a real need to get intelligent, thoughtful, articulate perspectives on some of these issues of human sexuality.
Right. There are so many issues that are in the headlines that we want to help equip people to talk about, but we also, in addition to helping ground them in biblical truth, we want to talk about the kind of tone we need to have when we talk about it. Slam dunking is not really what we're going for either. So we tried to find a group of experts that could each talk on their topic. So Gary Barnes and I saw ourselves as sort of curators. Mm-hmm. We're not experts on each of these topics, although we are on some of them, or we like to think we are in some of them. But the idea being that we bring in people who are the best qualified to talk about these issues, but in a way that is winsome.
And when I first saw this and it came across our email, I said, this is kind of a who's who of individuals on all sorts of topics that we oftentimes find ourselves addressing here: sexuality, gender roles, identity, marriage, sexuality, cohabitation. We talked about with Dr. Gary Barnes the issue of divorce and remarriage and some of that. Then even pornography, sexual orientation, same-sex attraction, gender dysphoria. I mean, this is the kind of book
Me
that,
Too, Church Too. Yeah, it's all
wish we had a long time ago, because in some respects, these are topics that are now surfacing more and more, don't you think?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, some of our students tell us that these are the topics people ask them immediately when they find out they're in seminary, but we don't typically cover these the first semester. And so just our desire was that professors, pastors, students, lay people, clergy would have some sort of guide from the experts with, as I said, an ironic tone.
Yes. Dr. Glenn Kreider, I was just thinking about the fact that if you look back at Dallas Seminary when it was started by Louis Sperry Chafer, or even when you had John Walvard and others, I can remember the way teaching was taking place at Dallas Seminary, and most of these issues we were not talking about. You were not talking about infertility. You were not talking about genetic engineering. You were certainly not talking about gender dysphoria, transgender. So in some respects, the students you're treating and teaching now having to address issues that their parents and grandparents never had to think about.
Yeah, and in addition to the students wanting to ask these questions, these are the questions that our graduates are asked when they interview for jobs. At the top of a list often is, so what's your position on this and this and this? What's different, I think, today is not that these issues didn't exist back in those days, but we weren't talking about them back in those days. Now they're in the public square. Now everybody's talking about them. So desperately needing a biblical, Christian, ironic way to talk about the issues.
And again, some of that might have been covered maybe in a pastoral ministries class, but you're having this show up. Of course, you've taught in Christian education, theological studies, and those kinds of things. You can't avoid them now. Even when you're just, quote, teaching the Bible, they surface instantaneously out of some of the text, don't they?
Yeah, and I don't want to overstate the transition, but from the past, where theology was largely a communication of what we believe, very indoctrination oriented. It's now much more an integrated discipline, and these are the kind of topics that have to be addressed. They're addressed biblically, they're addressed culturally, they're addressed historically, and theological studies has to do all of that.
Well, again, I'm just so grateful that you have put this together. Let's talk about how the book is structured, and then I want to maybe talk about the two atoms in spiritual identity, which is one of the chapters there. Matter of fact, chapter 2 by Dr. Glenn Kreider. But first, you go through some of the material, then you have a whole section for discussion and then for further reading. So in some respects, even though this is intended to maybe be a handbook for an individual, the way I was looking at this, Dr. Glahn, I was thinking this really could be an ongoing Bible study or small group teaching or something like that, couldn't it?
Absolutely. It is designed so that if you want to have discussion after it, here are what the authors of each chapter suggest are the hot topics to hit. They also left us with a recommended 3 resources if you get interested in a certain topic and want to go further. And the bibliography at the end is ginormous.
Yes.
Just huge. And so there are lots of ways you can take it if you want to study further. But one of our endorsers described it as each chapter is sort of a TED Talk. You can pick it up, get 40 to 50 minutes on a certain topic. You don't have to take it any further, but if you want to, the resources are there.
Well, let's start the TED topic on the two atoms. But first of all, it gets into the issue of identity. Dr. Glenn Kreider, let's, if we can, talk about the word identity has certainly showed up a lot. Sexual identity, gender identity, as well as even this intersectionality and things like that. But one of the first things you raise is a good question. If indeed your identity is in Christ and you're a Christian, what impact does it have on all the other characteristics? Because that's kind of where you take us through this identity in Christ, right?
Yeah, and so much of the conversation related to identity, it seems to me, misses the main thing, misses the main point. So 2 things. One, as we work our way through the New Testament, particularly the Apostle Paul, he is focused on 2 groups of people. There are those who are in Adam and those who are in Christ. There's no middle ground. There's no other ground. You're either in Adam and you're in Christ. Then I think we can have a conversation about how do we handle the other aspects, the other elements of our identity? Are they hierarchical? Is the only identity that matters that we're in Christ? Or how do those things fit together?
Well, we'll take a break and we'll come back and talk about personal identity. And is that fluctuating or static? And I think we know that it's not static. And then spiritual identity and how that fits together. And so we'll spend a little bit of time in that one. And then Dr. Sandra Glahn, I thought we would talk about gender, because that's a gender identity, male and female. And then, of course, one book that you have written quite a bit on, the whole issue of infertility and contraception and reproduction and much, much more. So all part of a book called Sanctified Sexuality. The only frustration I'm starting to surface from some of our listeners is, I want the book now, but it's out next month. So we're giving you an advance look, and we'll come back with our conversation right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
It appears that mathematics and grammar are now also examples of racism and Western imperialism. At least that is what we're hearing on a number of college campuses. Nancy Piercy writes about one teacher argues that the idea of 2 + 2 = 4 is cultural and a product of Western imperialism and colonialism. Apparently, even mathematics is to be reshaped by critical theory. Lest you think this is the only example, she provides many others. A professor at Cambridge University wrote an article titled Western Mathematics, the Secret Weapon of Cultural Imperialism. A professor at University of Illinois complains that math history is Eurocentric because we emphasize terms like Pythagorean theorem and pi, which perpetuate a perception that mathematics was largely developed by Greeks and other Europeans. Nancy Piercy questions that. We use Arabic numbers. We have learned that the concept of zero as a placeholder came from India, and the Babylonians gave us a 360-degree circle. In fact, most cultures had a rough idea of the value of pi. Meanwhile, grammar is also under attack. The English department at Rutgers University is changing its instruction in an effort to stand with and respond to the Black Lives Matter movement. The program will emphasize social justice and critical grammar. That's a euphemism for challenging the standard academic form of the English language. One of the professors argues that expecting a student to write in grammatically correct sentences is indicative of racial bias, which she condemns using a word I cannot use on this radio station. Lately, when I've been reading social media posts, I've been appalled at the poor grammar of recent college graduates. Apparently, it's going to get much worse. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Socialism, go to viewpoints.info/socialism. That's viewpoints.info/socialism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again in studio with us today, Dr. Sandra Glahn and Dr. Glenn Kreider, talking about the book Sanctified Sexuality. Is published by Kriegel Books, and it's an academic book that I think you're really going to appreciate. 23 different chapters, just an incredible amount of information, as well as a bibliography and for further reading and discussion and the rest. But Dr. Glenn Kreider, let's, if we can, talk about this, because one of the aspects of identity is our personal identity, and that changes. You even take us through a little bit of your own identity. And so how do we put that together within, just in a minute, talking about our spiritual identity?
Yeah, our personal identity is changing. So I've always been the son of Elvin and Thelma Kreider. I have not always been the husband of Janice. I have not always been the grandfather of Marlo. I have not always been a THM and PhD grad of Dallas Seminary. There are aspects of my identity that are permanent. There are aspects that I'm male, by the way. Yeah. That there are aspects of my identity that change and develop, and that I think there are two things to be avoided. One is to treat those aspects of my identity as some kind of a hierarchy, that one of them is more important than the other.
Good point. And
the other question is, what is it that defines who I am that will exist in the eternal state? So in the resurrection, I will always be a son, a father, a husband, a grandfather. And so that I think when we think in terms of, think in terms of what is part of me now that is permanent and unchanging, what is part of me in the eternal state, that's really the place we ought to start, and avoid the hierarchy that somehow the most important thing is that I'm Christian or male, that I'm same-sex attracted or other sex attracted, or that I'm a Christian, that those kind of conversations, I think, get confusing.
I know you didn't really get into the issue of race, but, when we see in the book of Acts 17, we're all of one blood. There are remarkable differences in terms of some of the secondary racial characteristics and things of that nature. But again, looking at it from the light of eternity, maybe that's a very important way to begin to see what is relevant and what is not relevant, right?
Yeah, I think so. That's one of the places this conversation often happens. And I saw it yesterday on Facebook with one of our grads who asked the question, am I a black man who's a Christian, or am I a Christian who's a black man? The answer is yes. Now, this is not one of those is more important than the other, that this is who you are.
Now, again, you have a whole section here on spiritual identity. And so, again, you say personal identity is kind of a combination of all those characteristics, but a spiritual identity is more difficult to define. So let me put you on the spot and try to define something that's difficult to define.
I think it is. Many people have observed that it's difficult to define. I think it's simple to define. But that it's simple to define doesn't mean it's simple to explain and unpack. I think the best way to understand spirit is in terms of relationship to the Holy Spirit. So what is spiritual is the relationship to the Spirit. So because I am no longer in Adam, I am in Christ. I'm no longer in the flesh. I'm now in the Spirit. That's my spiritual identity. That too is a way of summarizing who I am, but it's not exclusive of all the other things that identify who we are. So that I would prefer not to describe a person who is not related to Christ by means of the Spirit as a spiritual person. Spiritual indicates connection to the Spirit of God.
And that's the way you're using the idea of the first Adam and the second Adam, right? Explain that for people that maybe haven't been reading through the book of Romans or Genesis lately to think kind of through what that means.
Yeah, and I think that the connection you made is the right one. It's a big deal for Paul in Romans, but it goes all the way back to the Pentateuch, particularly Genesis. That all human beings are born in Adam. We are descended from Adam. And because we are descended from Adam, we have a connection to him, a connection that results in our being born sinners and ultimately experiencing the consequences of his sin, the penalty of his sin in death. When one comes to faith in Christ, one moves then from being in Adam to being in Christ. That our identity is now defined by who our head is and what community, what relationship we're a part of. And I think that's the place where identity language is really helpful. But I also think it's important to say that the language Paul uses, union with Christ, that we are in Christ, is not often what people mean by identity. That term identity is often used, and some of it's connected to the culture in which we live, where people choose their identity.
Yes.
I didn't choose to be born in Adam, and I didn't choose to be born again by the Spirit of Christ. That happened to me, and that now defines who I was, and that, as you know, is Paul's argument in the book of Romans. You were in Adam, you are now in Christ, so live like who you are.
Very good. Again, that's chapter 2 in the book. And Dr. Sandra Glahn, I would like to come to you because, of course, when we talk about sorting out male and female, again, you didn't choose to be male or female, but now people are saying that I can choose my identity as male or female. So in some respects, this chapter 5 has gotten a little more complex than it was just a few years ago.
Chapter 5 is looking at gender. And what I'm focused on in that chapter is giving us language to have the conversation where we're using the same definitions, which, as you know, is pretty important.
Yes.
So it really helps if we differentiate between sex and gender, because then if sex is a synonym for male and female, and gender is a synonym for masculine and feminine, then that helps us have a conversation. When we hear someone say gender is fluid, and what they mean is,
right,
don't put me in a stereotype box if I'm a female and you call me a tomboy. There's a spectrum of what is gender. And this is, I think, at times the church with good intentions, has made it more difficult, because if you're a certain kind of female or a certain kind of male that doesn't fit the, male macho, female, super feminine, loves pink, if you don't fit in those boxes and you're told that therefore you're not a feminine or a masculine person, it's really not helpful. And so for the church, we want to talk about, let's use gender as expressions to describe the expression of masculine and feminine, and recognize that a lot of it is culturally informed. When my husband and I go to Kenya and we see a woman on top of a roof with a hammer and she's fixing it, she's doing feminine work fixing the roof, being a roofer in Kenya. But if you see a woman in America doing the same thing, she is not considered feminine in our culture. And that is what we mean. And that's what a lot of people mean when they talk about gender being fluid. The problem that creates for us, obviously, as Christians, is we have to ask questions before we get into a discussion to say, what do you mean?
Yeah.
How are you using that? Are you saying you can choose what sex you are, which is different from choosing how to express your embodied self? I'm embodied as a woman. How am I going to live that out? And so one of the challenges in the church as well is that we have tended to create classes on manhood and womanhood and looking at how do we express ourselves socially, but we are often going to the marriage passages to answer that. So we'll say, like, a woman is made to be submissive, and a man is made to be head. And you have to go back and go, what were we given to express ourselves as we're created? What are we told we're supposed to do? And right back in Genesis, we are to multiply worshipers and have co-dominion over the earth. And then when it talks about who we are to become, it looks a lot more like love, joy, peace, patience, the fruit of the Spirit, embodied as a female or embodied as a male. So instead of trying to figure out how to be feminine, I'm supposed to be trying to figure out how to be Christ-like.
Right.
And that other stuff usually works itself out.
And I love the fact that you use the Kenya example, because a woman on the roof, not atypical in Kenya, a little bit less likely here, or the word pink. Pink is feminine, and the people in Kenya going, no, it's just a beautiful color. So I just love that piece. So, and again, there's some real wisdom in this in terms of if you're going to be a missionary and take your biblical Christianity to another culture, you begin to realize what's biblical and what's cultural. And so you really kind of take us through that. So we'll come back and talk about what about this idea of biblical masculinity and femininity, because you can define it and then talk about how to kind of understand some of this. And then before we're done, if you don't mind, we'll get into reproduction, contraception, and infertility. You and I always get into the controversial issues, don't we? I just can't even believe that. But again, if you find yourself saying, well, I want to get a copy of that book, it is coming out next month, and we wanted to give you an advance look. If you are interested in any one of these topics, I think you will benefit by 23 different chapters in this book that is called Sanctified Sexuality. It's published by Kreider. Dr. Sandra Glahn and Dr. Gary Barnes are the editors. And, of course, we also have Dr. Glenn Kreider in studio with us today. So let's take a break. And during the break, we'll also begin to refocus on a couple other issues here. But if you'd like to join the conversation at any point, feel free to give us a call, 1-800-351-1212. We'll be back right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Let me just give you a brief overview of some of the chapters here, because we've been talking about the two Adams, but also the idea of male and female, and even gender, male and female, and interpersonal expression, and those kinds of things. Adolescent sexuality. How many times have we spent time talking about that issue here? Celibacy, the marriage bed. Of course, one we'll talk about in just a minute. Reproduction, contraception, and infertility. Cohabitation by Scott Stanley. We've had him on over the years and some of the research. And of course, we even quoted him the other day when we had Dr. Gary Barnes on talking about divorce, and in Hall Harris on divorce and remarriage, a topic there. One on forced sexuality, rape. And the whole issue that we have been addressing there of the hashtag Me Too movement, and pornography, prostitution, sexual orientation, same-sex attraction, gender dysphoria. I was just thinking, Dr. Sandra Glahn, some of these issues we weren't talking about even a few years ago, even on Point of View, and they are all on the table every single day.
Yeah, and some of that is certainly because of something bad that's happened. But some of it is really good in that we are having conversations that would have been helpful to have. Me Too is a great example, where when the Me Too hashtag went viral, following that was Church Too, and people started talking about abuse in the church. And while it's depressing to think about it, but it's been there. But now it's coming to the light, and we know from the scriptures that it's good for evil to be exposed. So some of it can be depressing when these things are brought out, but it can also be a sign that the Spirit is at work in cleaning house and helping us disciple students to cover some of these issues.
Yes. Well, again, as I went through this list, I thought it was just a great list of topics that need to be addressed. And we were talking about Chapter 5 here, and I noticed one of your questions, even for discussion, what does it look like to image God embodied as male or female? Because a lot of people say, okay, God made me this way, but then I'm supposed to be getting my identity, we just talked about, in terms of being in Christ, but how does that manifest itself as an individual created in God's image?
Right. So at the break, Dr. Kreider was giving me a little bit of a hard time for backing off on gender, because I said I kind of backed off on it being socially constructed. And the reason for that is because there is brain wiring. Okay,
yes.
So we're not saying that there's not a physical element. What the challenge for us is that we don't have to know exactly what the brain wiring does, or we don't have to know exactly how you have to act in order to be considered a woman. What the scriptures seem to be emphasizing are the way that you act is to be Christ-like, and you do that embodied as a woman, or you do that embodied as a man. So my father could show the exact same tenderness to me that my mother did, but it's still fatherly.
Yes.
And I think
Well
that
said.
what I mean by that is we are in the realm of mystery, I think, when we're trying to dissect what is feminine and what is masculine. You know, there's that proverb that talks about there's a way with a man with a maiden, and, you know, that's one of the four things that's a mystery. And so in that sense, I think at times we've tried to dissect the mystery a little too much and focus exactly on how am I supposed to be as a man, or a woman, which is a good question, but the scriptures are much more focused on how am I supposed to act as a Christian?
Yes.
How am I supposed to act as a child of God? And instead of I think it's a little bit like focusing on how to be happy. You become happy as you focus on other things. How am I the woman I'm supposed to be? I become the woman I'm supposed to be by acting Christ-like. And I am embodied as a woman. I can't help but become the woman I'm supposed to be if I'm filled with love, joy, peace, patience, goodness, kindness, those elements of the Spirit.
Dr. Glenn Kreider, let me for just a minute maybe talk about some of the difficulties that when you have students who maybe came from broken homes, maybe didn't come from Christian homes. Both of you went to Bible colleges, and so you hit Dallas Seminary with maybe a little better understanding. But I see some of these young men that probably you've had a chance to minister and mentor that say, I have not a clue as to what it means to be a man in Christ because I didn't have a father, or I had a father who was the worst example of that. And that's one of the big struggles we face here in the 21st century, isn't it?
And the same thing is true of those who lack mothers. To add to what Dr. Glahn just said, there's a a wide continuum of expressions of masculinity and a wide continuum of femininity. And what often happens is when a particular kind of masculinity or a particular kind of femininity is elevated and focused, those who don't fit into that mold, into that pattern, feel left out, minimized, pushed aside, etc. But you're exactly right. We live in a world where dysfunctional families are the rule. This is not something new. Go back and read the book of Genesis. Dysfunction in families has always been the
broken
case.
branches on your family tree back in Genesis.
But it is true. Whether or not it was always the case, but I think those of us who grew up in good homes and went to Bible colleges thought that everybody was just like us, and it's unusual. We've all got, as many people have observed, many of us have father wounds. We're trying to solve that problem. We're trying to earn respect from people who are dead or who don't care about us. And how to deal with those kind of things. Students sometimes act out in an attempt to demonstrate their frustration and anger, or they act out trying to be what they think they need to be. My dad tried to make a hunter out of me. I'm not a hunter. I'd rather look at a deer run through the field than to shoot it and eat it. And I always felt like I failed him because I didn't measure up and I couldn't have that experience with him. And to be fair, to be honest, I always felt like my dad really didn't understand me. But he's gone. Yeah. And it's now trying to earn his respect is not very healthy and helpful. But I can look at the next generation and the students I teach and say, how can I help you not repeat the mistakes and errors of my father and that I did along the way? And I think the kind of, and that's part of why this book is so helpful, not just my chapter, that it actually does provide a way forward. It provides a way of thinking about, a way of talking about these issues that is healthy and is redemptive. As she said, the point is not the Me Too, Church Too was really negative, but it doesn't help to bring redemption by ignoring the reality of what's there.
If nothing else, it causes us to be much more careful about accountability and asking good questions and doing various background checks and all the things that weren't happening in the past.
And there's one more thing I think that it really helps us see, and that relates to gender, and that is that we need to not just model what it looks like to be a man or a woman in Christ. We need to model loving one another as friends. Yes. And showing our students and the world that as brothers and sisters in Christ, we can have these healthy relationships. Avoidance is not the only way to handle that, right? It's to be mature and to love one another deeply from the heart as we're called to do. And so what does that look like? We, as of all people, have the way forward on that, which is that we're family. So we don't think of family in sexual terms. We think in family in terms of love and commitment and fathers and mothers. And so certainly we need fathers and mothers, sisters and brothers. And so we need to be embodied as male and female and embrace that, but not the way the world has done it.
That also is part of the same issue. If you've not had healthy family relationships mentored, modeled for you. If you haven't experienced them, it's really hard to view the person of the opposite sex as my brother or sister. The way you said it is so profound. We have always recognized that sexual perversion inside a family is perversion. Yes. Why don't we have the same kind of horror for brothers and sisters in Christ in the church?
Well said. Very good. And that's the kind of discussion that comes from each one of these chapters, because you have some for further reading and you have some discussion. And I suspect that some of the best things that will happen when this book is in the hands of individuals in the church is to have some discussion and some practical application about how to take some of those things that we've talked about there. So again, 23 chapters. It's part of Kriegel. Since I'm coming up to a break, let me just mention that after the break, we'll talk about reproductive reproduction, contraception, and infertility. Sure, we can cover that in one segment. I know we can't. I know we can't. But nevertheless, we'll certainly introduce that, and it's just one more example of that. And so if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. I may take a call, but again, since I have two experts sitting across from me, maybe we won't today, and we might take some of those calls after they go, give them a chance to go on to the busyness of their lives, but we might take some of those calls afterwards if that is a fit. But when we talk about this issue of reproduction, contraception, and infertility, this is a big issue. And again, if you're going to be in ministry, if you're going to be a pastor, you're going to be a Bible fellowship teacher, a small group leader, you've got to understand that is a big issue. Modern day Hannahs are out there, and we want to talk about that, and we will do so right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes talking about this book coming out, which is Sanctified Sexuality, Valuing Sex in an Oversexed World. Dr. Sandra Glahn with us, and again, author of one of the other chapters, Chapter 12. Also with us, Dr. Glenn Kreider. But Sandra, if nothing else, talk about this for just a minute, because you, of course, look at this both from an experiential point of view as well as an exegetical point of view, but we've got to help our listeners understand. And if you're a pastor right now, you're a Bible fellowship teacher, a small group leader, there's a very significant percentage of individuals of childbearing age that are dealing with infertility, aren't they?
It's about 12% of Americans of childbearing age are dealing with infertility and pregnancy loss, which infertility includes pregnancy loss. And so often we have many friends that are going through it and don't even realize it. It's not the sort of thing you typically put on Facebook. And so, but because our churches, to their credit, are pretty pro-family, the downside of that is it's really rough on our celibate friends, and it's really rough on our families that are trying to conceive or conceive again. Secondary infertility, which is the inability to conceive and carry to term after you've already had a child, is also a pretty big problem. And so, but it raises a whole different set of issues. You're having to go to the nursery to drop off a child, and people are asking you when you're going to give this child a brother and sister, which typical, couples with no children aren't dealing with that, of what do I do with my maternity clothes, just whole different sets of issues and trials and pains.
Yes.
Sure.
And Psalm 127 shows up quite a bit, doesn't it, in terms of children as a gift or the gift.
Yeah.
And that's how you wrote about that chapter. Speak to that, if you will.
Children are definitely a gift, but they are not, as you said, the gift. They are a wonderful blessing from God, but there are lots of different blessings from God. Certainly in Genesis, we see be fruitful and multiply before the fall. And so it's definitely heartbreaking when you want to be fruitful and multiply, and particularly if you're in the context where you have a lot of love in your marriage that you want to spill over to a child, and it's not happening. And so I think we do see a shift in the New Testament. It was actually all the way threaded through the Old Testament of multiplying worshipers that is not just physical reproduction. But nevertheless, it is one of the things that is never satisfied. The Proverbs, again, tells us there are things that are never satisfied, and one is the barren womb. If you want children and you can't have them, it's devastating. I had one friend who went through cancer and went through infertility, and she said infertility was much harder.
Yes.
But nobody can really bring you meals for infertility. Like it's just a completely different grief. And what we're concerned with that in this book is partly to help people have compassion and know how to come alongside those who are suffering. But we're also looking at the ethical issues for those wanting to navigate high-tech treatment. And so you're looking at, what do you do with the human embryo?
Right.
What are the limits of my dominion in this situation? And what are personal convictions with that? You have a lot of folks that just don't even think it's right to go to the doctor. And then you have others that are looking at in vitro. There is a way to do in vitro fertilization that's ethical, but you have to really be in charge of your treatment and make it really clear what you are and are not willing to do.
I might even mention that you have whole sections here on, of course, artificial insemination and donor insemination and egg donation and surrogacy and all these complicated issues that just a few decades ago, since I'm the old guy around the table, we didn't have to talk about
much
in the
before 1979.
Yeah, that's right. That all changed
really
in the 1980s rather dramatically. And what would you say for, in the broader sense, for just a minute, our listeners out here who maybe aren't sensitive to either celibacy, because you have two chapters on that, or infertility? It's difficult because you want to talk about families, and almost every church, and a lot of our listeners go to family-oriented churches, evangelical churches, where we talk about family. But there is a concern that a number of people that are single, a number of people there that don't have children, feel like, well, you're just saying that God's best never came to me.
Yes, we have a young female grad who just told me, she just called me this week and said, I was brought in to interview for a position discipling youth. And after they got me in the interview, they said, this would really be easier if you were married. And she's devastated. It's like, you knew my marital status before you even brought me in. And just this idea that our people that are committed to following Christ, whether married or single, are feeling this pressure so often. So one of the things we can do in the church is stop asking, when are you going to get married, or are you dating anybody? And just that implies that you're not complete as you are.
Yes.
And ask questions like, what's meaningful in your life? Who are the nurturing forces in your life? Something tame. And then if you're close enough to someone, they might bring it up, but it's really kind of a none of your business sort of question.
When you're going to get married, when you're going to have children, all those kinds of things.
Both of those questions, off limits.
And Dr. Glenn Kreider, you've been a pastor, so speak to this issue, because I think this is the kind of book I would want to put in the hands of people that are in ministry, certainly pastors. I can't imagine how you'd be a pastor and not want to have this book on your shelf. Maybe right next to your Bible, I don't know, but nevertheless, how can pastors use that?
Yeah, so the when people say mean stuff or dumb stuff, sometimes it's because they're mean. But I think most times it's wanting to say something and not quite sure how to address it.
Yeah.
And that's, I think it's helpful for us to change the script, to recognize that family is important, but there are a variety of forms of family. That it is true that many people get married, but for whatever reason, some people choose not to get married. And I don't think, as I'd say it maybe a little stronger than she just did, I don't think that's any of your business why people choose to be married or not be married, and to choose to have children or not have children. There are adults who are childless by choice, and that doesn't make them inferior. This is really, I mean, we're brothers and sisters and a variety of approaches. But the other component here that is really important pastorally is singles. And as we acknowledge the reality that some people are attracted to the opposite sex and some people are attracted to the same sex, to recognize that their attractions are probably not changing. What the scripture is concerned about is not attractions, but actions.
Right.
And what we call people to do, Wes Hill's chapter in the book, what we call people who are same-sex attracted to is a lifestyle of celibacy. And that lifestyle of celibacy is sometimes at cross purposes with the way we talk about the importance of the family. And I think we need to be pastorally really sensitive to that and to find ways to encourage and support. Wes would call us to the church stepping in and being the family for the people who don't have family members. It's the loneliness. It was his book on spiritual friendship that really changed my perspective. The loneliness that we are calling a person who chooses celibacy to. I mean, I've got extended family. I can call them at Thanksgiving, Christmas. Those are family times. If you're alone and if you've chosen that approach, so I think pastorally we have to be sensitive, and by sensitive I don't just mean feel good, but actually be intentionally and active,
gracious and loving, and
opening up your Thanksgiving table, Yeah, we're family.
Yeah. Wesley is the author of the book or the chapter on same-sex attraction, washed and waiting. And so, again, just some great material. Dr. Sandra Glahn, thank you for pulling this together. Thank you and Gary Barnes for having the vision. And the book, again, is called Sanctified Sexuality, Valuing Sex in an Oversexed World. And it is published by Kriegel, and it's coming out next month. And I appreciate you both coming in and talking about it today.
Thank you so much for having us.
We encourage you to find out a little bit more. If you would like to correspond with either of these individuals, we also have their Facebook page and their Twitter link. We also have your website, and we also have information about the book. I would encourage you to reorder it. It might show up before September 22nd. That would be great. Again, you can get it both in paperback and in Kindle. So we're going to take a break. We'll get back into some of the issues in the news right after these important messages.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour, we're going to spend some time, first of all, looking at a number of issues in the news. And if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Then we're going to spend some time talking with Andrew McDiarmid at about the bottom of the hour. He's media specialist with the Discovery Institute and an individual that writes for Breakpoint and a variety of others. He's the author of the blog Authentic, Thinking and Thriving in the Digital Age. So I think you'll appreciate that. But let's, if we can, first of all, talk about the pandemic. 160,000 Americans have died of COVID-19, so I don't minimize that at all. But at the same time, we're starting to see some real clampdowns that are taking place around the country. And it will also get us into the conversation, which we want to have in just a minute, about should we reopen the schools? Because a number of students are now sitting in classrooms, even today. Others will be trying to learn online. And I'm saying try to learn because of some of the difficulties there. But to illustrate the clampdown, let me just take New York City as a good example. They are now setting up checkpoints into the city for out-of-state travelers. Now, of course, if you fly into LaGuardia or Kennedy, of course, they will check you there. But now they are putting checkpoints at the major bridges into New York City and into the tunnels into the city. This was announced by Mayor Bill de Blasio. And again, saying New York is holding the line against COVID-19, and New Yorkers have shown tremendous discipline. We're not going to let our hard work slip away, and we'll continue to do everything we can to keep New Yorkers safe and healthy. Their estimates, I'm not sure how they come about this, but anyway, their estimates are that about a fifth of all their new coronavirus cases in the city come from out-of-state visitors. So indeed, if you come in by plane or train at Penn Station, they're checking individuals as well, or by car, they will be checking you. And if you violate the quarantine, I've seen some of the fines are up to $10,000. So very serious about that. And I think we'll talk about some of those issues in just a few minutes. But let's, if we can, get into the question of opening the schools. I recognize that when we bring up these topics, many of you may disagree, and that is fine because we try on Point of View to give you some information you don't have. A very significant majority of parents do not want their kids in school because they're fearful of that. And yet you've heard me in the past point out that the American Academy of Pediatricians has actually said that the school should have a goal of having students physically present in the schools. The New England Journal of Medicine the other day said that children living in poverty, children of color, English language learners, children with diagnosed disabilities, and young children face especially severe losses. And, of course, we're able to pick up child abuse. We're able to pick up maybe medical issues for the school nurse. Of course, it's the distribution of food and a variety of other issues. But I recognize we can probably agree to disagree about whether or not we should open the schools or not. What I hope we can all agree on is the fact that, as this first article I've posted on the website illustrates, that many of these teachers' unions are now using this coronavirus as an opportunity to squeeze money from taxpayers and put their private and public charter school competition out of business. That's a direct quote from the editors of the Wall Street Journal. They point out that the leader of the American Federation of Teachers declared support for what are called safety strikes. That's where if a local union determines or deems that there has been insufficient emphasis on trying to mitigate COVID-19, that they will actually call for a strike against the school. Now, the determination's pretty subjective, by the way, but nevertheless, that is the case. Then on Monday, you had an alliance of teachers and teachers' unions and progressive groups calling for a national day of resistance around the country, listing their demands that they want met before they would return to the classroom. Now, what are those? Well, it would be canceling rents and mortgages, a moratorium on evictions and foreclosures, direct cash payments to those who are unemployed, a moratorium on any new charter program, any new voucher program, any standardized testing program, and then just spending an enormous amount of money, which would be funded, according to them, by taxing billionaires and Wall Street. And so the editors of the Wall Street Journal said, there's a word for that. Actually, they said it's a phrase for that. It's called political extortion. Rather than work to open schools safely, the unions are issuing ultimatums, threatening strikes until they're granted their ideological wish. And they say, children who have to endure more lost education are becoming the hostages. And so you're seeing some of them actually lobbying to keep charter schools closed, private schools closed, and the rest. And again, I quoted from New England Journal of Medicine, the American Academy of Pediatrics. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention say reopening the schools with in-person instruction is actually a step towards improving public health, especially for low-income and minority children. But if that's not enough, now when the public schools are closed, you have some governors, not all, don't want to paint with too broad a brush, but a good number of governors who say that if the public schools are closed, the private schools and religious schools have to be closed as well. Well, there's a difference. Public schools are funded whether they are open or not. The private schools and religious schools, they rely on tuition and donations, and they don't have that luxury. And the Cato Institute Center for Education Freedom already has documented 107 private and religious schools that have been shut down permanently. Let's go back to New York. I mentioned that a minute ago. New York's Catholic Archdiocese has announced the closure already of 20 schools. So some very significant issues in the news. So let's, if we can, maybe take some phone calls. Maybe you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. We'll head out to the state of Maine, WSEW. Steve, thank you for joining us today.
Hi, Kerby. Thank you for taking my call. I heard a comment that you had made on the state of New York, or the governor wanting to close the borders to protect the fine residents of New York. I find it kind of amusing because up here in Maine, when this first all started in New York, was a huge hotbed in the nation, especially New York City. The vast number of out-of-state plates up in our area were New York plates. Everybody there wanted to get the heck out, and they all came up here to Maine.
Yeah, and probably brought some of that disease with them and turned Maine, at least certain parts of Maine, into a hotspot. Yes.
Yeah, they did it by closing the border during that time, but now, it seems to be a one-way road.
Yes. Well, I appreciate you calling. We were cutting out on your phone a little bit, but I think we got the basic idea there that just at a time when now we don't want people from out of state coming into New York City. And I understand that. Matter of fact, some of this hard line has been around for some time. As Steve points out, people from New York City, or at least from the upstate, and it could have been from upstate New York, it could have been other places, ended up in Maine. So we'll take some more phone calls in just a minute. One of the issues certainly we want to put on the table is I recognize we might agree to disagree as to whether or not to open the schools. But this first article that I've posted, which the editors of the Wall Street Journal called School Opening Extortion, are starting to show a little bit of the face of what's happening in some of these teachers' unions, and we're learning more about that every single day. We've got a lot more to cover, but we'll also take some more phone calls right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
It appears that mathematics and grammar are now also examples of racism and Western imperialism. At least that is what we're hearing on a number of college campuses. Nancy Piercy writes about one teacher who argues that the idea of 2 + 2 = 4 is cultural and a product of Western imperialism and colonialism. Apparently, even mathematics is to be reshaped by critical theory. Lest you think this is the only example, she provides many others. A professor at Cambridge University wrote an article titled Western Mathematics, the Secret Weapon of Cultural Imperialism. A professor at University of Illinois complains that math history is Eurocentric because we emphasize terms like Pythagorean theorem and pi, which perpetuate a perception that mathematics was largely developed by Greeks and other Europeans. Nancy Piercy questions that. We use Arabic numbers. We have learned that the concept of zero as a placeholder came from India, and the Babylonians gave us a 360-degree circle. In fact, most cultures had a rough idea of the value of pi. Meanwhile, grammar is also under attack. The English department at Rutgers University is changing its instruction in an effort to stand with and respond to the Black Lives Matter movement. The program will emphasize social justice and critical grammar. That's a euphemism for challenging the standard academic form of the English language. One of the professors argues that expecting a student to write in grammatically correct sentences is indicative of racial bias, which she condemns using a word I cannot use on this radio station. Lately, when I've been reading social media posts, I've been appalled at the poor grammar of recent college graduates. Apparently, it's going to get much worse. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Socialism, go to viewpoints.info/socialism. That's viewpoints.info/socialism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, 1-800-351-1212. We'll get to those phone calls in just a minute, but my first article comes from the Wall Street Journal and the editorial board, School Opening Extortion. Two others, which we may or may not get to since we're going to take a number of phone calls. One by Ari Fleischer, who was the press secretary for George W. Bush, in which he again raises some very significant questions about the safety of voting by mail and even raises the prospect that we could have another like the 2000 election, in which he said, I wouldn't wish this on anyone, but even in the 2000 election, it was really postponing a decision about whether George W. Bush or Al Gore would be the president. This time, he makes a very compelling case that we may never come to an ultimate answer in this regard because of mail-in voting, so that's there. And then the third article, which we probably won't get to, but I have talked about in the first hour, if you would like to hear it, Cheryl Atkinson pointed out that some of these fact checkers really aren't very unbiased, and that probably is not news to you. But let's take some of these phone calls real quickly, and we'll go to Shelby in Georgia. Thank you for joining us today.
Hi.
You're on the air.
I was calling because I heard on the radio, I'm blind, so there was an article about kids camping in the magazine National Geographic, and it stated that kids are getting the COVID and, they're catching it from each other and et cetera.
Okay. And first of all, we do see that they sometimes indeed get the disease and they are infected. And then number two, what we do find is that they don't seem to be the spreaders that we thought. At one point, there was a real concern as to whether or not young children would be super spreaders. Now they're not only not spreaders, but they seem to be what's called a break. They don't spread it any further. Do we have examples of kids going to camps and getting COVID-19? Yes. Do we have very many examples of any of them dying? No. Do we have some that have some, maybe not mortality, but morbidity? Sometimes. And so there are certainly a need for any school, if it indeed is opening up, to consider everything from 6 feet distancing to masks to various kinds of cubicles, maybe even having staggered recesses so kids aren't out with each other all at the same time. And again, I recognize that some people just simply say, I just don't want to take the risk with my child. Okay, I get that. But there are consequences, as we pointed out before, for staying inside. And of course, the real concern is that this online education just has not worked out very well. But let's take a few more phone calls. We'll head to KYCC. Nancy, thank you for calling today.
Yes, hi. I have two ways of looking at this situation with the teachers. When I came back from Germany, I was a single parent with 2 kids, and I taught for 2 years at a Catholic school. I went to a Catholic school growing up until 7th grade, so I know that. However, those were nuns, and I don't know what kind of retirement the single teachers or civilian teachers got. However, I know that I did not have any retirement at the Catholic school. I had no medical care. That's my biggest problem with with private schools, is what are they giving their teachers? Because right now I'm 20 years with a retirement, $1,800 a month after they take out whatever for taxes. And that's pretty slim pickings. Luckily, I live in El Paso. However, I did substitute teach for the other 10 years and other jobs with the education system here. Some of your charter schools are getting money from the state of Texas, but what are they giving their teachers?
Yeah.
I mean, that's the other big thing. In terms of retirement, some of the teachers that are in a teachers union, I know that the one I belong to went to bat for me 2 different times, because I had somebody that was out after me, and I was a really good Texas and U.S. history teacher. However, I do know that the ones I've seen recently, everything is left. And I'm a natural family planning teacher, pro-life. I can't even open my mouth. I can't tell people who I voted for, except if I'm in the classroom and I don't talk. I talk issue, pro-life, and a natural family planning teacher. Every one of them at this one high school at Bowie, every single one of them, you're all special. And the girl pulled out her cell phone with her little baby, 6 months old. And I said, you get to be a reader. You read to that little baby. But that's one of the issues that I have is retirement. You know, I don't know what those teachers in those charter schools or the private schools have.
Yeah, I don't either, but it's something to think about. And again, you know, the retirement issue, maybe we'll put that on the agenda to talk about in the future. But I just thought it was kind of interesting that what we have right now is safety strikes and even a National Day of Resistance. And that's first I've heard about it. And so when we know a little bit more, we'll let you know what is happening with the teachers' unions. And I noticed just the other day that Dr. Gary Bauer, not Dr. Gary Bauer, was saying that, you know, the lead editorial in the Wall Street Journal says that this is political extortion, which we talked about, issuing ultimatums. And I love how he ends his piece. He says, first they close our houses of worship, then they take away our right of assembly. Now they're holding our children hostage. He says it's getting hard to distinguish the progressive left from a hostile foreign invader. So that's one of the articles there on the school opening. And I recognize that right now most people are hesitant about school openings. At the same time, a lot of people are hesitant about whether or not we should prevent more voting by mail, because a lot of people concerned about the pandemic are saying, I would rather vote by mail. But as Ari Fleischer in the second article I've posted points out, is that at election night, we still might not know who won. And he points out the fact that if you look at some of the polls right now, I'll be the first to admit that these polls don't mean a whole lot, but nevertheless, Donald Trump is up by about 5,000 votes over Joe Biden in Florida. Joe Biden is up by about 5,000 votes over Donald Trump in Ohio, but then you've got too close to call: Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Wisconsin, Iowa, Georgia. And so, again, given the fact that last time we had 33 million absentee ballots which were cast, and this time, there's reason to believe, first of all, that we're going to break all records for the number of people that will vote, and we will increase the number of not just absentee ballots, but vote by mail ballots, which are different, by the way. We could run into a problem. And he uses the example that I mentioned just the other day. We do not know in the state of New York, in the 12th congressional district, who won. That's just amazing to me. I mean, this happened back in June. We're talking about August, and we do not know whether the incumbent member of Congress, Carolyn Maloney, won, or whether her progressive opponent, Surjaj Patel, won, because they basically had so many of these, and these were absentee ballots, not mail-in vote ballots, which are a little different. 25% of them were rejected, or 12,000 votes, which has now led to the opponent, to Carolyn Maloney, to sue in court demanding every vote count. And the point that he makes is a good one. We do have a number of states that have had mail-in balloting for years. Let's use the state of Washington as a good example, since that's one of the ones he uses. They have a long history of mail-in voting, but it took years to get their process right. It was bipartisan and fair, but it wasn't conducted in the midst of a pandemic. And now that you're having more and more individuals being on the front lines arguing for mail-in ballots, you just see the potential for a disaster. And as Ari Fleischer, I think, makes a very compelling case for, we may not on November 3rd know who won. And it won't be like what happened in 2000. For those of you a little bit older, remember what we had when we weren't sure if George Bush or Al Gore won. But eventually that got resolved. There's going to be less and less opportunity to even figure out where that is, if indeed it's another close election. Let's at least hope and pray that whoever wins in November wins by hundreds of thousands of votes, and then we won't have to deal with this issue. But it's just one more reason for many people, a vast majority of Americans, think they have no problem with voting by mail. But one more time, I just want to put one more piece on the table to help you think through whether or not that is a very safe way to elect the President of the United States. Anyway, we're going to take a break. When we come back, we're going to spend some time talking about, can our technology glorify God? Andrew McDiarmid is going to be on with us, and we'll spend some time talking about his article that we've posted and some of the information that I think you will appreciate, as he makes a distinction between kind of the Christian worldview and the tech industry worldview. Very well done. And so I think you'll appreciate his conversation. And so we'll spend some time talking with him. And of course, we'll also open up the phones to give you a chance to join the conversation as well, if you'd like to do so. That coming up right after these important messages.
"2020. It's been a pretty eventful year. We've experienced international tensions over the coronavirus and lockdowns, economic uncertainties, cities overrun by protests, rioting, and looters, and coming soon, a presidential election. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It is easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Last half hour, we're going to spend some time talking about technology from a biblical point of view. Our technology can glorify God, and here's how. And this is a piece that appeared in Breakpoint, and it is written by Andrew McDiarmid, who is the media specialist with Discovery Institute's Center for Science and Culture. Writes on the subject of technology in places like the Breakpoint, San Francisco Chronicle, Seattle Times, and others. Author of the blog Authentic: Thinking and Thriving in the Digital Age. And so, Andrew, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Kerby, thank you for having me.
Let's, if we can, for just a few minutes, kind of get into the definition of technology, because in some respects, that is going to be key to our conversation, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. You know, it can mean a lot of things to a lot of people, but one thing's for sure is that it surrounds us every day. And we're not going to get away from it at any point in our lives. And it's useful to kind of go back and see what this word really means. And I got excited as I did so recently, and I wanted to share that with listeners. You know, the word technology, it is actually about us, but not in the way that we might think. Technology is defined as the sum of the ways in which social groups provide themselves with the material objects of their civilization. So where do these material objects come from? Well, if you take a deep dive into the word, you see that the prefix techno comes from the Greek techne, which is art, skill, craft in work, a system of making or doing. And if you take the deeper root there, it's tex, T-E-K-S, and it literally means to weave or fabricate. So in other languages, the tex root forms words like axe or hatchet, or action words like carve, join, build, or unite. In English, we get words from it like textile, tectonic, text, tiller, and even toil. So the heart of the word technology, Kerby, is the art and skill used to build objects useful for human living.
And so when you talk about technology, we can have this ongoing debate as to whether or not technology can be used for good or evil. Certainly it is. Whether its very nature, inception is, but certainly we can certainly agree, as you are talking about, that we have two different kinds of worldviews. We have, of course, the biblical worldview that you write about in this piece on Breakpoint, and you've written about in other venues. And you then have kind of the tech industry worldview. And so when you work your way down the list, there are some tendencies for us as Christians, if we aren't thinking biblically, to uncritically accept kind of the tech worldview rather than a biblical worldview. Because when we talk about technology, it's really tied into the dominion covenant or the cultural mandate to go out there and to subdue the earth. And by using technology, we're able to redeem, in some respects, some of the physical effects of the fall. We live a much better life because of technology. But most of the time, we really haven't been thinking about technology from a biblical point of view, have we?
Not really, and it is very tempting, and sometimes we don't even realize that we're buying into a worldview that runs contrary to the Bible. You know, the worldview that reigns supreme at many tech companies and in the tech culture at large can and is different than the Christian worldview. And I think it's something we really need to be attentive to and then apply some critical thinking to so that we don't fall into that. The first thing is I tell people we can't assume tech companies have our best interests at heart.
Yes, I think we figured that out by now, haven't we? Yeah.
You know, they care about your eyeballs, and not your vision, of course, but how much you're paying attention to things, your daily habits, your data, and your money, but they don't care about your soul or your well-being or your faith or your relationships. You know, that falls to you. But yeah, if you go down the list and kind of compare worldviews, you know, you have the ultimate authority of self, which a lot of technology can buy into, the self-gratification, the self-indulgence, the self-awareness. You know, it's all about the self. And when that's your ultimate authority, truth becomes relative, as you well know, and everyone's got a different truth. And we contrast that, of course, to the Word of God and the fact that we hold that to be absolute truth. But you go down the list, the view of eternity is different. You know, tech enthusiasts and visionaries have always seen this utopia down the road, you know, where we can marry man and machine and create unlimited potential and progress and eliminate inequality and pain. It sure sounds like heaven, but there's no God around. We've created this ourselves. And so you see that. The view of suffering, as you mentioned, suffering is something that is unnecessary in the tech world and can be eliminated if we just work on it enough. The tech industry has a phrase called pain points, and constantly you've got teams of tech professionals who work on these pain points. How can we fix these pain points for the people in the world? How can we take away the suffering of doing dishes a certain way or having to find something that's lost? How do we fix that? And that does run contrary to the Bible's view of suffering and our view of the world as a fallen world that groans under the weight of sin.
Again, as you point out, this view of eternity, or what's sometimes called eschatology, is this idea that we're going to move towards a singularity, transhumanism. All those kinds of ideas are certainly embodied in the tech world, but we as Christians need to think more critically about that and be less likely to uncritically accept some of those ideas. What about this idea of money? Because, most people in the tech world are in it for the money, and that also helps us understand that we're not necessarily producing all this for your benefit. We're using it ultimately for our benefit because it's profit-driven. Nothing wrong with profits, but you just have to remind yourself of that, especially when you go on to a free site. If the site is free and the platform is free, then you're the product, aren't you?
Yeah. There's no free lunch. There's no such thing as free except the gift of salvation, of course. But, it reminds me of the sly advertising that Google has been doing recently for their Google Pixel phone. It's make Google do it, get all those annoying, mundane tasks in your life and just give it to us, but it's not for our well-being. It's to create data point upon data point that they can amass and then give access to the highest bidder and make their billions on advertising. I mean, in the first quarter of 2020, Google made $41.2 billion in revenue, and yet their services are free. And that mystifies some people, but if you dig a little deeper, you'll understand that what they're selling is you, and they don't have your best interests at heart. I'm not harping on companies that make profit in capitalism. It's a beautiful thing, but there are limits, and you have to think about these things. There are ethical decisions to be made, But you do see that profit drives business decisions in tech companies, and we contrast that with the things that Jesus has told us, sell your possessions, give to the poor, your treasures in heaven. It's not about all the things we can amass, the money we can amass. There's more than that.
Well, it certainly is. And again, you've talked about that in terms of their view of money, their view of possessions. Just before I take a break, let's talk about one more, which is certainly one that we have written about. I have a booklet on social media, and that is politics, because the tech companies are taking sides. And again, that is understandable. When I go to certain websites, I know they're going to take a free market or conservative point of view, or they're going to take a socialist point of view, whatever. But a lot of these tech companies are presented as providing a neutral platform, but that's not exactly how it's played out, is it?
No, it isn't. There's bias with every news source, and we just need to be aware of it. We need to look at the places we're turning for news and just be honest with ourselves. There's a lot of places we can turn, but, the bias is there. And social media platforms can be amazing tools to connect with folks who are like-minded, to connect with friends and family. But, in a lot of cases, they're trying to be the arbiters of truth, or rather maybe they've been forced into that. And, it's a tough thing running a global monster of a social media site. What do you do with all that content, So it really, again, falls to us to pay attention to where we're getting news, to pay attention to how our data is used. As you said, many tech companies are taking sides in the culture war, and bound to cancel culture and boycott tactics. The fear is there, and the hostility to certain points of view. And, the first step is just being aware of that,
Sure.
As Christians, the Bible should dictate our positions in politics and the culture war. And we always need to be prepared to give an answer to anyone who asks us for the reason for the hope we have. But, we do it with gentleness and humility, and we're ready for that,
Andrew McDiarmid with us as we are talking about his piece, Our Technology Can Glorify God. Here's how. We come back, we want to give you some practical suggestions. How can we use critical thinking with our tech tools? So we'll give you some practical suggestions on how to do so. And if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. We'll be back right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Andrew McDiarmid with us as we talk about how our technology can be used in a way that glorifies God. And if we can, Andrew, let's talk about maybe using some critical thinking, some practical application to our tech tools, because we're surrounded by technology. And as Christians, maybe we take too much of it for granted. So how do we begin to start the direction? I guess we want to, first of all, develop a habit of doing some critical thinking and developing discernment. And if there's a word I've been using over the last couple of months, it's the need for Christians to develop discernment. But tell us about what you would suggest in terms of using that discernment when we talk about some of these tech tools.
Absolutely, yeah. Once we realize that technology is to do with action and not just sitting around on a screen for hours a day, and once we understand that the art and the skill in any given tool refers not just to the maker of that tool, but to the one who will harness it and use it, it becomes pretty exciting, to figure out how we can use tech tools to glorify God with our work, our witness, and our walk with Him. I've come up with a few critical thinking questions, and then there's more. This is not exhaustive, but some questions you can start to ask yourself. And actually, before you get into thinking about your technology, I mentioned first that you do need to evaluate your relationship with God so you can know His will for your life. That is the first step to realizing what tech tools would be useful to have. James 4:8 says, as we draw near to God by purifying our hearts of sin, He will draw near to us. So I do encourage readers and listeners to take some time to evaluate that step. What is the will of God on my life? And once you've done that, you can start asking questions about the technology in your life at that point. Is using this tool a wise use of my time? Does it encourage me to think for myself, or does it dull my intellect? Does using this make me lazy or entitled? Does it help me to use my God-given abilities and gifts? Does it help me accomplish what God wants me to do? Does using this compromise my witness? So those are some questions as you start to think and reflect about each tech tool. And when I've mentioned technology, I'm basically talking about the personal tech tools we use. I mean, as we know, technology can be everything from paper to jumbo jets, but it's the gadgets in our life, that can either distract us or further the cause of God in our life. And so I use these questions to kind of think before I, take on that smartwatch or fitness tracker or Bluetooth tracker or some other smart device. I take some time to think, and answer those questions.
Very good questions. Let me, for just a minute, going back to your article that was posted here, talk about the interesting, I guess it would be irony, because in some respects, the digital world has brought us closer together virtually. And that has been helpful in large part because we have been in lockdown, in isolation many times. But even in the midst of that, as I have written booklets on social media, my more recent booklet was on the loneliness during lockdowns, because loneliness is reaching, as you point out, epidemic levels. Suicide has risen dramatically. So we have this interesting irony in that in one sense, we're closer together digitally than we've ever been before because of the technology, but in many cases we're more isolated and lonely than ever before. What about that?
Yeah. I read about a phenomenon where the more virtual interaction you get with humans, the less you feel is needed elsewhere. And they offered that up, the writers of this particular piece, as a reason for why we seem satisfied with virtual connection, but our health and well-being shows otherwise, But you're right, suicide has been rising in the last 2 decades. During the pandemic, higher suicide rates and spikes in calls to hotlines have been reported. We're not going to even know the long-term effects of the health crisis on mental health, for years. It's true, we're basking in the glow of our technology. We have all this stuff around us to keep us entertained and informed and connected, and yet, in many respects, we're unhappier than ever before. So it's useful to look at why that is and take steps to ameliorate that, to change that. There is no substitute for human-to-human, face-to-face interaction. And I think that, you see all the stories in the Bible, there was no gadgetry running the things, the stories that are in the Bible. It was all people working with other people and having a strong faith in God that was unwavering during times of trial. And I would just like to see us developing more of that, even in the midst of this rise in technology use.
Lisa, if we can talk about your website, it's authentic.today, and we have a link there. And so you've got sections here on why you don't need a smartwatch, and tell Alexa you're busy driving, and in the age of smart tech, discriminate, and Bluetooth trackers and the art of losing, and how Netflix hooks us and how to stop it. So you've got a lot of really practical material that people can find when they go to your website. But talk about what they'll find when they land there.
Yeah. It's just articles from one Christian, from one parent, from one media guy, one tech enthusiast to another. I don't claim to be a professional expert in this category. I've taken interest in it for several years, but I didn't necessarily get a PhD in it or write a book yet on it. But I just want people to know that I'm somebody who is struggling through these temptations myself, and I'm trying to offer up ways that people can continue to think and thrive for themselves in the digital age. You know, I have 3 daughters and a stepson at home. It's a tough job to help raise them to, first of all, submit to God's authority, and second, not get lost in what the world has to offer. But when people go to authentic.today, they're going to get a variety of articles on how they can think for themselves. You know, might involve a longer route to something, but, you know, the easier, more efficient way isn't always the better way. I take a humorous look at commercials and advertising for technology and kind of break it down and show people what's really going on with these tech companies and what they're after. So folks are really going to get a handle on some tips and tricks and advice on how to manage the tech on a daily basis that's in their life.
You know, one of the things that is kind of a theme that runs through your article is the idea of boundaries. And of course, we've interviewed the authors of the book Boundaries, and you really need to set some boundaries, need to have some discernment, need to have some thinking through and some critical thinking on these issues. So again, I commend to people, first of all, the article, which you can read, Our Technology Can Glorify God, Here's How. And then number 2, you can go to the website there and find all sorts of other articles, blog posts, and the rest that will be helpful to you. So, Andrew, I appreciate the good work that everybody up there at Discovery Institute does, and it's just been great to have you on the program today to talk about technology.
Kerby, thanks for your time and for having me.
We are going to take a break, and this really has been kind of a theme today of trying to look at these different issues from a biblical point of view. We talked with Dr. Sandra Glahn and Dr. Glenn Kreider about their book that will help you think through a lot of issues about sanctified sexuality, and that book is coming out in September, so you might want to pre-order it right now. Then we've also spent some time here talking about technology and how that fits effectively. In addition to that, I might just point you to the other articles we've posted on the extortion, if you will, of school openings, voting by mail, and one we didn't really have a chance to get to, but very well done by Cheryl Atkinson about the fact that not all fact checkers are created equal. Some of them have incredible biases, so you need to be aware of that. My Viewpoints commentary today is on whether or not math and grammar are racist. You know, I'm not making this up. That just shows you what's happening on college campuses today. So you'll find all of that at the website, pointofview.net. And I hope that you'll be able to join us tomorrow here on Point of View. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for their help behind the scenes. We'll see you back here tomorrow on Point of View.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.